Great, thanks, Mrs. Dowling. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out to our Meet the Expert Night virtually. Just want to talk to you a little bit about tonight and the purpose of tonight. It's really to bridge the homeschool connection and really to try to continue to forge relationships with our families. I always feel that when educators and parents can link arms, the kids are going to benefit the most. And we certainly understand that over the last 18 months, it's probably even more vital now to be able to link arms and really figure out how we can best support our kids, not only at school, but also at home as well. We have a few consultants or experts that we say that will be working with our staff this year so that our staff can also best support our students and be able to provide them with the best quality education possible. One of our consultants, unfortunately, just shortly before our event began, she had a family medical emergency. That's Meredith Alvaro, our math consultant. So she cannot join us tonight, but we are definitely keeping her in our thoughts, and we're hoping that everything works out okay. However, she was very disappointed, and she did tell us that there was a resource that she wanted to share with our families, and we also got some questions that she wanted to answer. So we'll be sure to get that out to the community. And again, we apologize for that, but we do hope everything is okay with her family and that works out. We have other consultants tonight that you will hear from. But before we get into that work, I do want to pass it over to our board president, Mrs. Waldiz, and she will speak and, of course, thank the board for even being able to make this work possible. So, Madam President, I pass it over to you. Just make sure you take yourself off mute.
Good evening, and welcome to tonight's presentation. We're very excited about it and glad to see so many people are attending, and thank our experts for coming. The board understands the importance of working with the community and bridging school and home connections. Due to the COVID-19 school closures, it was natural to have angst about how student achievement was affected. As the board, we wanted to ensure we were transparent about some of the ways we were supporting staff and students this year. We began thinking about this actually back in June 1st at our board retreat. And I'm so happy that the board embraced my idea and supported it to hold an evening such as tonight. And then in July, when Mrs. Signori came on, she was eager to take our wish and run with it and do all that it took to prepare this night. So we're very thankful for that. When talking about student achievement, wellness and the availability to learn go hand in hand. The board places emphasis on ensuring our students are ready to learn. New mandates can be confusing, so we wanted to provide the parent community with an opportunity to meet and learn about how we are supporting our staff with state mandates. Tonight you will hear from the experts that are working with our staff on both our academic focuses and our student wellness. They will also provide ways you can support your children at home. So this is a very critical night and very important that we are sharing this with the community, and very happy to do so. So now I'll turn it over to Mrs. Kim Dowling, Supervisor of Curriculum and Instruction.
Thank you, Mrs. Waldiz. Good evening, everybody. I'm incredibly excited for our Meet the Expert Night. We've been planning this for months, and we are incredibly excited for you to meet our experts who have been working with our teachers in our classrooms over the past couple of months. Before we begin, I would like to do some thank yous. First and foremost, I want to thank the Board of Education for funding this amazing work that we've been doing in our classrooms with our consultants. We have Shelley Klein with us this evening, who is our literacy consultant. We have Alicia DiLorenzo, who is with us, who is our diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. And we have Alan Koenig with us this evening, who is from West Bergen Mental Health Care, and he is going to be discussing our partnership that we have continued with them since the beginning of last year. I also would like to thank our administrative team, and our administrative assistants for helping with scheduling so our staff can work with our consultants numerous times throughout the school year. I want to thank our consultants for being here with us this evening and with our staff throughout the year. Our teachers for taking what they're learning with our consultants and implementing that into the classroom. And I want to thank the parents for taking the time to be here tonight to really learn about the work that we're doing and how you can help your students and to really help strengthen that homeschool connection that's so important. I do want to let you know that this meeting is being recorded for some families that have reached out and let us know that they are unable to attend this evening. But we are recording it, and we are going to also be recording the presentations from the consultants, and we will be sending out the recording and also the slide deck, because there are links in some of their slide decks for you to use with your children at home. The first consultant that's going to be presenting this evening is our literacy consultant, Shelly Klein. She has been focusing on using data to create differentiated instruction, small groups, guided groups in our elementary levels, and infusing our new grammar program, Patterns of Power, with our students in grades 1 through 5. She's also been providing more of a workshop-centered approach, working with our middle school ELA teachers, so that can be infused into our classrooms. She has been an educator for over 30 years. She has presented at both local and national levels. She has a master's degree in education and reading. She is a certified reading specialist and a former New Jersey Governor Teacher of the Year. So we are very excited to have Shelly with us this evening. And at this time, I'm going to pass the mic over to her.
Before you get started, Shelly, I'm sorry to interrupt. Can we just make sure everybody's muted, just so we don't get feedback and we can really hear you? Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me, everybody, and hello to all the families. It's really nice to be here, and it really has been a privilege to work with the teachers in the district. I find everybody open and enthusiastic and really eager to understand some new instructional practices, as well as embrace new moves and teaching methods in the classroom. Today, my hope is to share with you your potential role at home to help grow your reader. And while Kim shared a lot of what I'm doing in the classroom to help bring new instructional moves with reading and writing and grammar and creating workshop model, always keeping in mind the balancing act of teacher role and student role. What I'm hoping to share with you tonight as I share my screen is how can you support your reader at home by using some of the ideas that I'm hoping to share with you tonight. So I'm going to just hit present and begin. So let's talk about how we can grow our readers at home. When we think about our role as families and our role in helping our readers grow, we want to think about what reading at home looks like and sounds like. First and foremost, reading should feel enjoyable, and it should be a positive experience for everybody where families, children included, feel at ease and relaxed. So I just want to define for us, so we have in our heads, the different types of reading that could go on at home. Recreational reading, a read aloud adult to child, or a read aloud child to adult. And so let's start off by just talking what is recreational reading. Recreational reading is just an experience that your child will engage in when he or she wants to read a book to himself. And that book could fit into what we call a just right book, or like at his or her reading level in a band, or perhaps a book that that child just enjoys. And so I encourage you all to really create opportunities where recreational reading is the real focus at home. That is one type of reading at home. Read aloud would be twofold: adult to child, where the parent chooses a book that is a book that you think your child will love, and you simply read to your child, where you are using expression and you're engaging in light conversation, but it doesn't feel instructional. You'll leave that to the classroom. It feels enjoyable. And then, of course, reading aloud, child to adult. So one of the things that I want to just talk about in this area is that when a child reads a book that he hasn't read, we call that a cold or a fresh read. When a child reads that book in his head first or in her head first, it's rehearsed. And then when that child reads it out loud, there has been practice. And so one of the things we want to be mindful of as a parent listening to a child read is that we don't want that child to feel, our children to feel like it's a performance. We want that to be an experience that's more shared. So one of the things you can do is you can encourage your child, read that page or read that part or read that chapter in your head first, so that when you read it out loud, it'll feel a little rehearsed. And so we want our children to feel that reading is fun and that they're not performing at home or that they're engaging in instruction at home. And I think when we gather around this idea as parents, I think that we create and cultivate sort of a feeling that reading is enjoyable and the experience puts at ease. So moving on, which is a real important piece, comprehension. When I think about comprehension, I think to myself as a parent, what does comprehension look like when it sits in my lap? So reading comprehension is really the most important thing about being a reader. In order to grow as a reader, we push ourselves to think about what we are reading. And that push happens before reading, during reading, and after reading. And I think as a parent, it's so easy to feel a little concerned if you're talking to your child about a book they're reading and the responses aren't indicative of deep comprehension. And so we want to jump in and sort of fix. But I'd like to give you some tools rather than fixing the comprehension, helping grow the comprehension, because your kids are in really good hands with your children's teacher. There's a lot of intensive and explicit reading instruction going on. And so what can you do to help continue to grow this? So when you think of breaking reading into 3 parts when it comes to comprehension, before reading, there's things we can do. We can talk about the title, talk about the pictures. We can talk about what we already know, about the author, about the book, maybe about the characters if it's a book in a series. We can make predictions. We can even question. And I would probably encourage you to choose 1 or 2 things to talk about. Then, while your children are either reading to you or you're reading to them, because comprehension happens in all those different types of reading formats, we may want to back up when we realize that our child is confused, or we may want to say, I think we should reread that part so we can really get it right. We could also ask a question here or there. I always encourage parents to forge more of a conversation. Like, let's talk about how we connect to these characters. Or I like to think about the chapters or the scenes in books as like scenes in movies, opportunities to visualize. So during reading, you can talk about what you're reading without feeling the need to just ask a lot of comprehension questions. I think we will open up the conversation with our kids if we use some of these suggestions. After reading, it's a nice idea to just go back to the parts we really enjoyed and let's talk about the parts that were exciting, or talk about the message that the author we were left with, or think about how does this book, excuse me, how does this book connect to other books? Or maybe just talk about what we thought about the book. And so I'm hoping with these guiding ideas, you feel like you have some tools in your toolbox on how to talk about comprehension that aren't really text-specific questions. Because if we want to create a climate or a feeling in our home that reading is fun and reading is recreational, and we want to put our kids at ease, we want to make sure it doesn't feel like school, but yet we have an opportunity to engage with reading and our kids. So let's dive into other parts of what makes a reader. So we've got comprehension, which is the most important part. And now we'd like to talk a little about accuracy. What is accuracy? Accuracy is the reader's ability to read the words in an exact way. And so this is where I think as a parent, it could get us feeling like, oh my gosh, some of these words aren't, read well, they're skipping words, and there's like a lack of accuracy. So I want to offer some ideas. When we are reading with our children, whether the child is reading to us or we're reading together, and we just hear that our children are stuck on some words, how to say a word. It's hard to do, but if we just create a pause and we let them say the word or give a little rest and we say the word, or let me say the word, so that we don't make it like the experience is like a test or a performance. And I think that's really important, that our kids feel like when we're reading with them, that it feels comforting. It doesn't feel performance-based. And so if they don't know how to say a word, you have a choice. Pause and just say, try it, or pause and say, or say the word itself, just give the child the word, or perhaps give a little encouragement, like this word rhymes with, or it starts like. But something we can do with our youngest readers is we can really guide them to using some of the picture clues to help them with word solving. But most of all, the important thing to do is, if there is an opportunity, reread that sentence so that the reader, your child, can hear how it sounds really accurate. One of the things that we teach our kids to do in school that I think is one that you can use at home as well, is just getting your child to recognize when something makes sense, when something sounds right, or when something looks right. And so just having that monitoring system inside, if your child's reading to you and reads a word that isn't correct, you might say, let's think about whether or not this sounds right in the sentence. Let's think whether or not this looks right or makes sense. And so just having those light sort of sentence starters could possibly help you as a parent get on your way. So we've talked about comprehension, we've talked about accuracy, and now we're going to talk about fluency. So what does that look like and sound like? A fluent reader moves through text smoothly, not too fast, not too slow, a few slowdowns, stops, pauses. So accuracy moves the reader into being fluent. So what does it mean to be fluent? Well, a fluent reader typically rereads books that are familiar. So for those parents that are reading the same books over and over again, great for you, because you are actually growing your child's fluency, that familiar rhythm and cadence about a book, especially for our K2 children. I also want to let you in that it's okay for our kids to finger point or finger sweep to follow the words, because in our youngest readers, that's a tool for our kids to have our eyes go ahead of the words they're reading, and it helps readers really get into the flow and then sort of sweep around to the next line. One of the things that we talk about in school that is just a cute little saying that you could use is let the punctuation be the boss of you. And that's a fluency piece, meaning the punctuation at the end of the sentence tells you how that sentence wants to be read. So the punctuation is kind of like the boss of you. And so as a parent, I would encourage you to use that fun, friendly saying, because it helps your reader or guides your reader into using the punctuation for how that sentence wants to be read. One of the things our kids could do to really create a greater sense of fluency is, another expression we could use is read like a star. And so when we think about how actors and actresses read on stage, very theatrical and very demonstrative, we can encourage our kids to read like a star. And what that means is we put ourselves in the place of the characters that we're reading, and we kind of take on that persona. And that makes reading with your child fun and a little carefree. So together, these ideas about comprehension, accuracy, and fluency will really help us grow our reader at home. And what I would say is kind of sprinkle in some of these things as you're reading. And I think if you do a little bit here and there every night, every other night, it'll really have a cumulative effect. So when you plan for reading at home, I think I just review a few ideas that we definitely want to get some library cards, plan a trip to the library, set aside something special, come and sit on the porch, let's read together. And this idea of creating a culture of reading is set up because you're kind of planning a journey together to the library or to Barnes & Noble. So I think planning for reading at home is helpful. You know, we think about, where do you like to read? So maybe talking with your child, like, where's your best reading spot? When's your best reading time? What's your best kind of reading? That really helps guide us into creating space for our kids to do what we hope they'll want to do naturally in a recreational way. I always think the main ingredient is choice, choosing a book you will enjoy. And so for K-2 kids, we've got the 5-finger rule. And that simply means open up to this new book, hold up your hands, and simply read it to yourself, putting down a finger for words that just get in the way for you. If there's more than 5 fingers down, that book is maybe a for later book. Anchor books are for upper grade kids. Like, think about the last book you read. Identify what you really liked about that book. I liked the chapter titles. I liked the length. I really liked the font. I liked there were some pictures in it. And then jot those ideas down just on a Post-it. When you compare the new choice to this anchor book, it'll help you weigh whether or not the new choice feels like the book you just really enjoyed. And so for upper grade readers, having an anchor book as a guide to choosing something new is often helpful. I also think guiding our kids to think about, like, what was the last book you read? Who was the author? Should we find other books by that author? Or, I saw you started a book in a series. Let's find more books in that series. So choice really empowers the reader. Choice continued when we think about where we get our books from: friends, family, borrowed, digital. Kids are used to reading digitally. We want them to read physically, but we want to talk about what's going to create the greatest motivation. And I always go back to, we've got to create new habits by making a plan. How do you want to read? By myself, with someone, to someone? How many pages? How many chapters? And so if we could have conversation, maybe to encourage our children to read more. So how do you want to read? Let's figure it out this week. How much do you want to read? And maybe we could share about it. We could talk about it. We could write a review. We could talk about our book. And so I think creating a habit and making a plan will help support that work. You know, podcasts are really a wonderful resource for children who like to listen a little bit more about their books. So authors of books our kids love have podcasts. And sometimes just listening to podcasts, not listening to an Audible, which is also a great idea, but listening to a podcast where they get to know the author can really help engage and excite our readers to engage with further text by that same author. And so we may want to think about whether our favorite authors have their own podcasts, or perhaps maybe that famous author is a guest on a podcast. Lastly, when we think about prompts to start a conversation, I gave you a handful to think about. Clearly, I wouldn't use all of these, but I wanted to just talk about having a conversation. I'm recommending that for families at home, when you really want to engage in book conversation, rather than using question words, who, what, where, why, how, just use statements that grow a conversation. So for those of you that are interested in really having conversations with your kids about authors that they like, you might go to the, I think the author wrote this book because, and then that opens up a dialogue with your child. Or if you're reading with your child, you might say, oh, here on page such and such, I noticed that the author did, and that might be something you notice, like dialogue or bold words. Or maybe you just want to talk about the character. And so there's lots of ideas on how we can open a conversation. Or maybe just talking about the book as a whole. You know, I really think this book is about, or when I think about this book, I think it really helped me understand that. And so if you initiate the conversation with a statement, it likely will engage a dialogue with your child. I'll ask that when you look at these, you put your own twist on them, because these are just ideas to get you going. But I have found in my own family and in my teaching life that when I remove the question word and I start in with a statement and I share my thinking, often it's an opportunity to open a conversation. And I also wanted to just note that these conversations can happen during the reading and after the reading, so they don't have a set place. When we share this Google Slides with you, you'll see that I have linked a lot of nice book lists for grades 1 and 2, K1 and 2, and then book lists for readers grades 3 through 8. And so I hope you'll find these resources helpful, and I know we're going to link them for you. At this time, I think I'm just going to answer a few questions that I have been given to satisfy some of the questions that you might have. The first question I have, I think I answered, which was, how can we encourage independent reading at home? And I think the first answer I would say is choice and making sure it feels recreational, not instructional, because home should feel like home and school should feel like school. But you have a key role, and I hope that I provided you with resources to use tools to help your reader. The next question is about children and their reading levels. Excuse me. So a reading level is, for parents that are on the call, a reading level is a letter that actually holds a larger definition than just that letter. So when your child's reading at a letter, let's say a child's reading at P, what we really like to think about is our child's reading in a band OPQ. And so it's larger than just that level. And so what does that level mean? That level holds characteristics. Like books at that level typically have XYZ characteristics. And readers at that level tend to hold on to certain behaviors. And so usually teachers use those levels to grow readers, because teachers understand all the characteristics of what makes a level and use those characteristics to grow the reader. My advice is, and this is a parent and a teacher advice, is that at home, reading feels more recreational. So books can be read when something's recreational. Books could be a little easy, books could be just right, books could be challenging. When books are really challenging, you may say, let's read this together, because then you're a support. When books feel just right, they feel comfortable. And then when books feel easy, it just feels like an old friend, like something to rely on, something that just feels comfortable. And so the answer I would have is, I would pay very little attention to a level and pay much more attention to engaging and exciting our readers and making reading feel fun and making our kids feel like we want to be a part of it with them. And so that would be my response. And lastly was a question on sight words, which is a little bit different, but I just want to answer it because I think I have a response that could suit the parent that asked. The question is, how can I get my daughter to practice her sight words? I have just a fun idea. If you want to practice sight words, play sight word tic-tac-toe. So you just have a piece of paper, you create a blank tic-tac-toe board, you become one of the sight words, your child becomes another, and instead of playing with X's and O's, you're a sight word. And so you're writing the sight words over and over again until someone wins tic-tac-toe. So sight word tic-tac-toe is a great way to practice sight word spelling without having to go through writing the spelling. You're playing a game. So I hope those satisfy the questions. I'm happy to answer any questions at another time, and I thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Shelley. For those of you who just got on the call or who did not see our flyer or who did not submit questions, we had asked for questions ahead of time, which is what Shelley Klein was just referring to on those 3 questions. We had 3 parents submit questions specifically for her. There was a spot to submit them via Google form. We needed them for purposes for scheduling for this evening. We will not be taking live questions this evening. And if you do have any questions that came up as you're listening to our consultant speak, please reach out to us. But we're just going to be reviewing the questions that were submitted via the Google form. At this time, we are going to hear from Alan Koenig. He is from West Bergen Mental Health Care. He's going to be talking to us about wellness and social emotional learning, because we all know that students cannot access the curriculum if they are not emotionally present. Alan Koenig is a licensed professional counselor. He has worked at West Bergen for over 15 years. He's provided services in the autism program. He co-developed the social anxiety program, and he was the director of the ADHD program. He's currently now the director of school-based services, which is how he came to us. He has overseen the development of school counseling services, and from what began as after-school social skills groups into more of a comprehensive on-site support system. So we're very excited to have you here, Alan, and now I'm going to turn the mic over to you.
Thank you, Kim. Yes, I'm Alan Koenig from West Bergen Mental Health Care, and let me just share my screen here. Okay. So just a little bit about West Bergen Mental Health Care. We are very happy to be in our 2nd year partnered with Rivervale Schools to provide on-site support, social emotional learning, as well as counseling services as well. So West Bergen was founded in 1963 as a child guidance clinic. We then expanded into, and this is before my time, expanded into large-based community mental health counseling services. And then in 1990, we began to expand into services for children and youth, and we opened up the Center for Children and Youth in Ramsey. And it's only fitting that as we've been really connected to the needs of the community, that the developing needs of students in schools has been the area that we have begun to move into. And so some of the things that we do in our school-based specialty programs is provide individual counseling on-site in schools, family therapy if needed, group therapy, crisis intervention work, as well as parent workshops and professional development for teachers, and also participate in district-wide social and emotional learning services. So today we'll talk a little bit about how we can provide some support for our students, particularly at home. I would like to think this is kind of a universal approach that we can use in assisting our children and our students to be as happy and successful as they can be. So the first thing regarding our children is we need to ask, like, what are their needs? And that sounds like a very simple question, like, what are the needs? But if we really take a step back and we really take a look at what the needs of our students are, it could be anything from physical needs, like needing to eat breakfast. So during World War II, they had realized that many young men were coming into the service without having adequate nutrition. And that really began to expand the school lunch program to make sure that students and youths were receiving appropriate nutrition throughout the day. And ultimately, like academic needs and emotional needs. And if emotional needs aren't being met, it's going to be very difficult for children to begin to learn and to learn at their fullest. And so we also have to ask ourselves, how have the needs of children changed over time? The impact of COVID, as well as over the time of their lifetime, from age 5 to say age 15. The needs of support may change and vary. 5-year-olds need a very different level of care than, say, 15-year-olds. And not that either one is easy, but they require a little different level of oversight and support. So ultimately, how can we as parents, teachers, caregivers assist with supporting our children and our students? So everywhere that I go, almost everywhere that everyone I speak to, anxiety and stress is the major topic that we constantly talk about. I have talked about anxiety and stress for a number of years, and as Kim had mentioned, I developed the social anxiety group because it has become much more prevalent. So in short, anxiety is the fear that something bad or damaging is going to happen. Like maybe physically, if I climb up this ladder and I fall off, the thought is I could get hurt. Emotionally, if I raise my hand and I ask a question and it's viewed as a dumb question, I will be embarrassed. So during periods of stress, and stress really means a period of change, feelings of anxiety are likely to increase, and we call that a stress reaction. So example of a period of stress would be returning to school. First day of school, everybody is a little anxious. Children and parents may be a little overwhelmed, and there's generally an overall feeling of anxiety and tension. Stress reactions often result in increased physical agitation, maybe a stomach ache, accelerated heart rate, and maybe feelings of panic. But a stress reaction can also include feelings of frustration or anger, and we liken this to the fight or flight response. If my response is with frustration or anger, then I'm activating the fight response. If I am anxious and I'm trying to get out of the situation, I am activating the flight response. So a few things that we can begin to do to help our children understand anxiety and stress and overall their emotional state is that anxiety is an emotion that occurs naturally. Anxiety really has existed for as long as humans have. It motivates us. If I'm not anxious about taking a test, I'm not going to study for my test. And anxiety keeps us safe. If I'm walking down the street and I see a snake, my initial reaction is to stop and back away. My anxiety is helping to preserve me and keep me safe. It'd be a very different story if I was curious and I went over and tried to pet that snake. It might not end so well for me. So anxiety is a natural emotion. It occurs naturally. It is part of the human condition, as well as stress. Stress is a normal part of life. As I said, stress is change, and change is occurring continually throughout our lives. So we want to normalize this understanding that anxiety is going to exist, and it's not necessarily bad. We have given it a negative connotation and made people afraid to feel anxious. And stress is going to be with us all the time. Every day of our lives, we deal with stress. Sitting in New Jersey traffic is stress. Getting our kids to school on time is stress. Everything that we do, paying bills is stress. It all requires a level of change and can create a stress reaction. But we are hardwired to adjust and adapt. And that is the message we want to send to our children, that you're capable. Human beings are actually quite an amazing species. We are able to live in deserts. We're able to live in the Arctic zones. We can live in jungles. The human species is capable of adjusting and adapting, both on a large scale and on an individual scale. The first day of school is always the first day of school. By day 10 is now day 10, I will have adjusted. The anxiety I felt on day 1 walking through the door will be significantly reduced by the time I get to Halloween. And also want to normalize other feelings. Sadness, anger, guilt are also normal emotions. So if we're sad because our dog died, sadness represents that we can have a connection with somebody else. We can experience empathy, and that's a good thing. So sadness in and of itself isn't necessarily a negative or bad feeling, even though it may hurt for a while. And guilt, when a child feels guilt, that means they have awareness that what they did was wrong. So we don't want to take away the feeling of guilt or minimize it. We want them to understand that you're going to feel guilty, and that's okay because that is normal. Ultimately, we want to build strength. And one of the things we want to focus on is helping our children set reasonable and attainable goals. Anxiety, sadness, frustration, anger all increase when the likelihood of failure increases. If I set a goal to get all A's and I get 1 B, I am going to be feeling really stressed out as I prepare for that last test. I'll be sad when I get my report card. But if I set a goal to get A's and B's, getting 6 A's and 1 B is a really good period. So reframing and understanding what is a reasonable goal, what is attainable. And not that we ever want to not work hard, but we also want to set ourselves up to always feeling stress because we're constantly in a state of trying to achieve at a high level that's causing so much anxiety and maybe ultimately sadness. We really want to help to identify strengths and skills, to focus on the outcomes. How have you handled this before? Yes, you're stressed out about a test, you're anxious about a test, but what have you done before? How have you studied before? What were your grades like before? Focus on what they can do, what they know how to do. Now, how do you know how to get the resources to complete your work? If you need to email your teacher, how do you do that? Instead of doing it for them, we want to prompt them to do it for themselves. So if our children are reaching out and activating their own skills and their own strengths, when we're not there, when their teachers aren't there, they will have the skills to do it independently. And we want to reframe failure. Failure is feedback that gives us the opportunity to make adjustments. Instead of looking at failure as the ultimate outcome, we can look at failure as what we can change. If I didn't study as much for my test as I have before, then that tells me that I need to study a little bit more. So I can adjust my actions, I can adjust my behavior based on the outcome. So again, failure is not an ultimate outcome, the end all be all. It is an opportunity for us to learn from what worked and what didn't work. Also want to talk about limiting information. Too much information is just as bad as too little information. So the more information I give children, more information that they come in contact with, it may be too overwhelming for them. And I think so much about what transpired in the past year and a half with COVID and how much kids heard, how much they heard about the news, overhearing so many things. And it increases their own level of anxiety that something bad could happen. And while COVID is very serious, we also want our kids to you're going to be okay. You were safe at home. Right? Negative aspects of social media, and I won't spend too much time talking about that now because I'm sure many of us who have seen TikTok or Instagram are well aware of the fact that the impacts of social media, especially when we're not able to monitor it, really can impact the self-image of adolescents. And what they see, what they become, what they believe is reality in terms of body image or style or what they may deem as cool is not always attainable or rational. And that sets a very negative self-image and creates the belief that I'm not good enough. And we want to avoid comparing our children to other children. Comparing them, saying what other kids can do, what other kids are capable of, implies that you're not capable of it, or you're not doing as good. Or to say, oh, Johnny did really well on his test, he never has a problem studying, doesn't focus on the strengths of our child. It focuses on the limitations or the things that they're not doing well, and negatively impacts their sense of competence. And ultimately, it's important to avoid discussing topics that are beyond their scope of understanding. Children do not need to understand certain things about money issues or things that are more adult related in content. Their brains aren't quite ready to process it yet. And so a second grader hearing about, changes in father's or mother's employment may not fully grasp what that means. And that may actually activate and increase levels of anxiety and stress that they cannot possibly rationalize. And so ultimately I also want to discuss how parents are models. Children watch and observe the behavior of adults. How I behave in front of my children will help impact how they manage their feelings of anxiety and sadness. And this is an actually true story. Just the other night, I become upset, and I won't get into all the details, but my in-laws were over, and my daughter was driving me nuts about I need ice cream, and my son was complaining very mildly about homework. And I did lose my cool. And as my son's brushing his teeth and we're getting him ready for bed, he turns to me and says, "Dad, why'd you yell at me? I didn't do anything wrong." And I thought for a second, and I said, "You're right. You didn't do anything wrong." And I was upset and frustrated about other things. And unfortunately, I yelled at you too. And for that, I'm sorry. And I apologize. And that modeling, the ability for me to demonstrate to my son accountability for my actions, despite the fact that I feel pretty embarrassed and now telling you that I yelled at my kids, right? A therapist yelling at his kids, like who would imagine that it demonstrates that we're capable of tolerating our feelings. We're capable of admitting when we're wrong. And that's okay. It is okay for us to be wrong. It's okay for us to be scared at times. It's okay for us to be anxious or sad. We also want to maintain perspective. Development occurs at different rates for different children. Going back to, we don't want to compare our children to other children. We do not determine when nature says we're going to develop, when we're going to enter puberty, right? Or when we're going to learn new skills. And just because skills are learned, they may not be mastered. And so putting pressure on children or setting expectations that they're not quite ready to achieve yet. I think of the parent who expects their kid to be a superstar athlete when they're not ready and they're yelling at them. That's not going to develop a sense of competence and well-being. It's going to develop a sense of failure. I'm not good enough. And so it's okay if our children learn and sometimes take a step back. It's okay if they demonstrate the ability to be responsible, but sometimes aren't always responsible. Development doesn't occur in an even line. It occurs in an up and down pattern. And each age comes with new developmental skills. You may have a child who is never anxious, never concerned. They hit age 11, they become of the social world around them. And as they begin to look around, they see what type of shoes other kids wear, what type of clothing other kids wear. And now their level of social anxiety may begin to increase. And we may not have expected that. But with new developmental skills and new developmental milestones, sometimes come new problems, and that's okay. It's a normal part of the progression for children to begin to have changes in their understanding and in their emotional control. And anyone with teenagers can understand and relate to the fact that they seem to lose emotional control at some point around age 14 and 15 at times, which is totally normal. And we want to continue to foster the sense of competence and responsibility through our modeling, as well as through our continued support in normalizing the transitions they're going through. In the case of adolescents, literally stress, because stress is change. And I leave parents with this question. I like to ask it, what is your goal for your child? And I encourage everyone to think about that. What is your goal? What do you want your child to achieve? What's important? And when we take a step back and really think sometimes, like, if we have healthy kids, we have kids who are going to school, we're in a pretty good place. And so sometimes we need to manage our expectations for our children and know that we also contribute to their sense of well-being and competence, and can contribute to their anxiety and stress if we set our goals maybe a little out of their reach, or are inappropriately too demanding. And so I encourage everybody, when you have a chance, to please reflect on that, think about that, and ask, what is it that you want for your children? And ultimately, what you can do to help them. I did have a few questions, so I will get to those questions quickly.
Ellen, do you want me to read you? Yeah, yep.
Yes,
Okay.
no, you
So
can go ahead and read the questions. I'm all set.
Okay, all right. We did have 2 questions for you, Alan. Question number 1 was, my child is experiencing high levels of anxiety around her grades. I want to make sure that my daughter works hard and accepts challenges, but how can I help her with this anxiety? She is focused only on the final grade and not what she is learning. There are nights where she is in tears. Please help.
My first thought is the first question I ask, what is the need? And I think of a child who's having this much anxiety. What is their need? Is it that they have they're driven by their own will, their own desire to achieve at a high level? And are they setting unreasonable expectations? So I think we have to ask the question and discuss with our children, why is this grade so important to you? Why is the A more important than anything else? And why are you willing to be so upset to get that A? And we also have to discuss and find out, if they're not self-driven, is there a peer culture? Are they relating to their peers who are so driven to also maintain A's, and there's a level of peer pressure coming, and they feel this expectation to continually achieve at an extremely high level? Because we have to ask and help them sort out, what are your goals? What do you really want for yourself? And it's going to make you happy. Is studying all night and crying making you happy? Is that the price you're willing to pay to get an A? Or are you willing to take maybe A minus and feel a little bit happier and enjoy your time at home? And also, as a parent, we don't want to constantly be putting out the fires and having to help decompress and help them manage their stress. We want them to do that effectively on their own. So we want to teach them the skills of developing goals, and also helping them expand beyond that. Like, the one grade does not determine who you are. What are the other things in your life that determine who you are? What kind of brother or sister are you? What else are you good at? What other activities do you do? So we begin to pull out, it's not just about the grade. You're a whole human being, and you're a whole person with other skills and other talents.
Thank you. And we have one more question, Alan. I am worried about my child's academic loss because of COVID. I try to do extra work at home, but he is always resistant. How do I encourage him to work hard and work with me at home without adding any more stress to his life?
So this makes you think of the question I ended with. What is your goal? As a parent, what is our goal? What do we want for our children? And are we looking for them to succeed at a level that we want them to? And compared to what? I would look at this and want to know, are we on par with other children? Are other children also experiencing the same level of maybe, I wouldn't want to call it education regression, but let's just say a fallback from COVID. And if other children are in the same place, then our child's not alone, and they're probably in good company. And I also think of this as getting into a power struggle. And at the end of the day, if a child is able to complete enough of their work and feel good about doing their work, and they feel competent doing their work, that is okay. And it's not always necessary to have to then do more. Just because we can achieve the goal doesn't mean we need to go on to another goal. Sometimes we can celebrate that goal. And if finishing my homework for the night, doing my work effectively, getting a good grade is success, I can allow my child to experience some of that success. And I don't have to go on to the next step, the next goal, because I want them to feel good about what they accomplish. And sometimes I always think about when my kids were young and they go on a play date. There's that sweet spot where if you go a little bit too long, the play date goes sour. And once the play date goes sour and you say, oh, how was the play date? It was horrible. It was the worst play date ever. Even though it could have been an hour and a half of incredible fun, the last 5 minutes was horrible. And so it's important to keep in mind, like, our expectations, like, we want to end as positively as possible with some success, because we can build on that. And we have a lifetime to go, right? The goal is to continue to grow and learn throughout our lifetime.
Okay, that was all the questions that the community had for you, Alan. Thank you so much. We are certainly grateful for our continued partnership with West Bergen. For those of you that are not aware, we do have a full-time therapist on staff here in Rivervale who works at all 3 schools from West Bergen, and we have continued our warm line this school year. Also with West Bergen. So thank you so much, Alan. Our last presenter of the evening is our consultant for diversity, equity, and inclusion, Alicia De Lorenzo. She is working on professional development with our middle school staff on wellness, diversity, equity, and inclusion. She is the founder and owner of Living Yes. She has developed integrative education model that systemically addresses social emotional learning, trauma, equity, and wellness in education. She has spoken at national and international levels. She has served in public education for 20 years. She has a master's degree in psychological counseling, and she is a licensed professional counselor. So I'm going to hand the mic over to you, Alicia, at this point. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kimberly. Good evening, families and the staff of Rivervale Schools, as well as the other consultants on the call. It was wonderful to listen to you. I actually started my career in Bergen County, just around the corner from Rivervale. And I want to just thank you for the invitation to be a part of your journey to grow as a community and to support the adult learning and the professional development of the staff in order to show up in new ways for young people, to consider coming into power through the most powerful resource we each have, which really is ourselves, and leveraging the impact of our relationships to build connections, to transform, and to heal. This is the foundation of all learning. Before we go any further, I want to center you around the core value of the work that I get to do with schools and individuals as a clinician and within communities. I haven't found a more meaningful way to do that than to engage you in this greeting. And this greeting comes to us from the South African Zulu tribe, and it's only 6 words. I see you and I am here. When someone enters into community, they're greeted with I see you. And the response follows, I am here. This deep sense of being seen is not to be confused with our social norms of, hi, how are you, as we race past people, not pausing long enough to even hear their responses. This deep sense of seeing speaks to seeing the humanity, the divine, the gifts, the dignity that exists within each person. And this requires a willingness of us to drop the stories or the falsehoods or the narratives and judgments that we tell ourselves about each other, and the othering that we uphold in order to spread hate as a result of our differences. So then to declare I'm here is actually a really courageous act of showing up, to really show up ready to be seen fully in all of our greatness and all of our challenges, to show up without the armor and the masks that we present as our true selves, right? So consider our Snapchat filters or our perfect Instagram feeds. It requires us to really show up authentically. These 6 words, I see you and I'm here, are simple at first glance. And they are pretty simple actually to live out if we're willing to let down some of our armor, let down some of our masks, to experience a change moment. You know, for others who struggle to really see people, to hear their stories, to listen to others, these 6 words could be painful to embody, even to have ourselves be seen. In that sense, the 6 words, I see you, I am here, are both simple and profound. And so I want to ask you to join me tonight and just getting centered, taking a deep breath, and bringing to mind somebody who in your life allowed you to show up, flawed and all, perfectly imperfect. And if you'd like to take a moment to close your eyes to bring this person into your mind, you can do that. So as you bring this person into your mind, I want you to think about, what did it look like, sound like, feel like to be around this person? How did they show up letting you know that you mattered, that you were valuable, and that you were loved? What did they do? What did they say? What was the feeling you left when you were with them? And I want you just to notice where that might show up in your body. Like maybe there's an openness in your heart or a softness across your face. I want you to think about the difference that this person made in your life by allowing you to mess up without judgment, allowing you to kind of grow and make mistakes. What did that feel like for you? And then I want you to just bring your attention back to our conversation, and you can open your eyes if they were closed. As you thought about this person, they probably could have taught you anything and you would have been engaged. There was probably a deep sense of connection with this person. And through this connection, not only is learning possible, but healing is possible. This is the foundation of all learning. So why is the work of equity and wellness important? Let me be frank, because children are dying. And I don't say that metaphorically. We are losing children to addiction, to violence, to mental illness, and to suicide. Long before the pandemic of COVID, we were facing a mental health crisis among youth. And let's not be so short-sighted to think that it ends with children, because it doesn't. We know that adults are suffering as well. A few data points around the mental health of adults and children right now. In 2020, mental health related ER visits among 12 to 17-year-olds increased 31%. In May 2020, ER visits for suspected suicide attempts began increasing among adolescents, especially girls between 12 and 17. But between February 21 and March 2021, ER visits for attempted suicide visits were 50.6% higher for girls between the ages of 12 and 17. Boys increased by 3.7%. 1 in 5 of our youth will experience a mental health disorder by the age of 18. And the delay between the onset of symptoms and treatment is 11 years. Now, when we think about adults, we know that 1.5 million people have experienced mental illness over last year, an actual increase of 1.5 million. And an additional 460,000 people, adults, are experiencing serious thoughts of suicide. When we look at teachers and school leaders, they experience more anxiety, more depression, and more suicide ideation than the average person. 57% of educators are concerned about burnout, and 75% of educators experience stress-related symptoms, including fatigue, lack of energy, irritability, heartburn, headaches, trouble sleeping, and depression. This translates to burnout. We're facing a crisis. The greeting that I shared with you captures both the problem and the solution. Many children and adults do not feel seen. They don't feel connected to or a sense of belonging. So if I'm not seen, then therefore I don't even exist. And if I don't feel like there's a place for me to exist authentically, then it's probably not hard for us to connect the dots to the behaviors we see that come from a place of not belonging. Anger, rage, isolation, self-harm, self-deprecating actions, ultimately making oneself not here anymore. You see, I don't have to tell you that at the root of all human suffering is a deep desire to be seen, to be heard, to know that you matter and that you are loved. I don't need to tell you this, because if we really look into our own pain, we'll find exactly this. Sadly, some of our children live in homes where they don't feel seen at all. And that can be a result of family dynamics, of divorce, of acculturation, identity, mental illness, addiction, domestic violence. The list goes on and on. There's many reasons. They live in communities where they don't feel valued. A Black valedictorian who bravely shares her experiences in the public school system only to be ridiculed and ostracized by adults in her community. An LGBT kid who courageously attends multiple city council meetings to request a pride flag to be flown during the month of June, only to be denied and the mayor refused to even read her proclamation. How is it that these young people feel seen or valued in their communities? And here is the most excruciating story of all. Some of you may be familiar with the most recent story of a New Jersey student who completed suicide this past July while sightseeing with his family in New York City. Upon climbing to the top of the vessel, a 150-foot structure at the center of the Hudson Yards, Shiv jumped to his death with his family nearby. Shiv's parents recently addressed the Board of Education in their town with the urgency to make schools more inclusive spaces for all children. His mother's plea to the board referenced what she identified as her son's greatest struggle. It wasn't lack of support from his family after coming out as gay, but a sense of not belonging in his community, amongst his peers, due to the negative narratives that rage through his community and culture. When it comes to schools, we can point the finger at parents, parents can point the fingers at schools, and we can keep going round and round placing blame. Many of you have heard it takes a village to raise a child. It also takes a village to fail a child. And I hear this over and over again, this consistent message of otherness, of not belonging and suffering that is plaguing our children. Once I left Bergen County, I spent my tenure as a teacher and student assistance counselor and New Jersey's first social emotional learning coordinator in an urban district, where my students were experiencing traumas like poverty, lack of access to resources, fear of deportation of family members, violence, and homelessness. One would think that the experience of kids in wealthier neighborhoods to kids in urban communities and other parts of New Jersey are vastly different. But being immersed in both communities as an educator, I know firsthand that our children across the state are more similar than they are different. In fact, regardless of economics and zip code, race, or other identity characteristics, kids were and are suffering. Research tells us that our country's most privileged youth are actually the most emotionally distressed. What's leading to that in most suburban communities? One study found particularly excessive perfection strivings that could be internally or externally, and isolation from parents. In a district that I work in, where the mean household income is $134,000, not too far off from Rivervale, which I think is around $150,000, they have sent on average 10 students a month to crisis for suicide ideation this school year. And they're not an anomaly. You know, I heard regularly, as I presented to more wealthier communities similar to Rivervale, the whispers when talking about mental health and adverse childhood experiences, or even race and prejudice, that it made sense that those were important topics to address in other places, like Newark or Camden or Asbury Park. And so maybe we want to marginalize these conversations and things that are happening somewhere else. But can we really continue to do this when our children's lives are on the line? Both the epidemic of adverse childhood experiences, mental health, and racism are hiding in plain sight. They're grossly unseen, grossly unaddressed, and not talked about because of shame. You know, it's a dangerous narrative to say, not my kid, and not in our community. And we don't have that problem here, or we don't have to talk about that. What's even more dangerous is to create misleading and false narratives rooted in fear when youth and adults are taking the brave and courageous steps to address the painful experiences of their peers. I want you to quote me that there is no place for shame in education. Learning cannot happen with shame present. There is no place for shame for our white children, for our Black and brown children, for our LGBTQ kids. Our role as adults in the lives of young people is to affirm them as they are and not as who we want them to be, or the stories we have created about who they are supposed to be out of our own sense of lack or fear, even if we don't understand them. So what can we do to support our children, even if we don't understand them or we don't understand what they're going through? I have 5 big ideas for you to take away from tonight. First, we have to do our own work. We have to get rid of what's standing in our way of connecting with our children in meaningful ways. And maybe what's standing in the way is a device. Maybe that's fighting through our divorces. Maybe that's a lack of work-life balance. What does this require of you? It requires you to get present, to build your self-awareness, and to take care of yourselves. That's why we're centering self-care and wellness for the middle school educators, because we know that they're struggling. We know that times are tough. And the best thing that they can do to prepare for their school year and for your students and children is to take care of themselves. There's a direct correlation between high teacher stress, low copability, and academic outcomes for the children in those classes. Self-care is an investment, not an expense. As a parent, I also recognize that there's a level of guilt when I have worked a long week and my kids want nothing more than to spend time with me, and I, head out to my acupuncture appointment. I feel guilty the whole time that I'm driving there, but what I know for sure is that when I take care of myself and I carve out that time, I'm a better parent. And as an educator, I was a better educator. When you're stressed, you have really little access to attachment and connection and learning. When we think about what we know for sure from brain science and neuroscience is that a dysregulated adult cannot help regulate anyone. So when our children are coming into our homes and in our schools and our classrooms with big emotions, if we're dysregulated, we're not going to be able to help regulate them. But when we are regulated, when we can get centered, when we can take a pause and breathe before our next action, then we can help regulate those big emotions that kids are bringing to the table. And the brain works just like this, right? At the base of our brain, it's there to regulate our body temperature, our heart rate, our breathing. The mid part of our brain, it helps us to relate and to create attachment. And then the top part of our brain, which is useful and the part of our brain that helps us reason and think and analyze and learn, well, that part of our brain can't get access. We can't get access to that part of our brain unless we regulate ourselves, unless we relate and connect with others. Then we can get to the reasoning and learning part of our brain. There was a contagion of suicides in a community across the country where one of my colleagues works. And they collected information from young people to ask, what do parents need to know? Why is this happening in your community? And what can parents learn? And overwhelmingly, the response was, parents need to take care of themselves because there's nothing left of them to give to us. They aren't talking about fancy cars or big houses. They're talking about your presence. They're talking about your time. They're talking about connection. So the second big idea for you tonight is to connect. There's 9 vital minutes a day to connect with your children. 3 minutes when they wake up in the morning or before they go to school. 3 minutes when they get home from school. And 3 minutes before they go to bed. Now, if we could fit in 20 minutes a day spending time with our children, doing or talking about something that interests them, we're going to build that sense of connection and that they matter. I'm a parent of younger kids, one middle schooler and younger, and I don't like Minecraft at all, but my kids do. And so I don't know how to play Minecraft. I don't understand it. But what I know is that it's important for them, for me, to know that it matters. So what do? I sit next to them on the couch while they're getting their device time, and I ask them to build me a farm and build me some other structure. And so they sit there and they build it. while I give them ideas. That lets them know that I'm interested, that I'm vested, that they matter, and that I carve out time like I do for everybody else to be with them. So this 20 minutes of time, it's non-judgmental time. It's not time to reprimand, to redirect. It's time to listen. It's time to be present. It's time to be flexible, maybe even to ask questions. So for example, my youngest son, when I give him this carved out time, sometimes we'll play a game and he might decide to change the rules, AKA cheat. And so in this 20 minutes of time, I don't reprimand him for not playing by the rules. I acknowledge and say, oh, so there's some different rules we're playing tonight. Okay, you can play that way for now. And so it's important that this 20 minutes of time that we're spending with our children is really intentional. This makes a huge difference, especially as kids are going through middle school and beyond, where our time with them is less and less. Third big idea is to start to replace negative narratives with affirming language. Language matters. How are you talking about mental health? Are you using words to describe people who you may see or know that are struggling with mental illness or addiction as crazy or other negative, dehumanizing words? Are we dehumanizing other cultures or races or gender identities when we hear stories or see folks in our community? Can you use affirming language and ask questions when you see people who are different than you? Can you ask questions as you're watching movies together about, hey, who's getting left out here? Or why do you think they're feeling that way? Right? Can you diversify your own libraries? As I heard the tips about reading and helping young people get excited about reading. Can we ask those questions and diversify our libraries at home so that when children make acknowledgments of differences, we can say, yeah, right, just like that book that we read together. The fourth is to acknowledge and affirm differences. And that kind of leads into what I was just saying. When we are not intentionally inclusive, we run a really high risk of being exclusive. This is not so much about being right, folks, as much as it is about just trying to get it right. And trust me, you're going to mess up. You're going to slip up. You're going to make mistakes. I know this because I do too. When we think about reaching educational equity in school, it's not a one-size-fits-all. This is not about lowering standards. In fact, it's about giving students all of the supports they need to rise to their potential. Equity in school begins with understanding the children that they may, be in school with that are different from them. It's preparing them for a workplace that has trends of increased diversity at the greatest rates we've ever seen. And this begins at the level of beliefs and values. What are our feelings as teachers about the kids that we're teaching, about the kids that may be others, about immigrant students, about kids that are wealthy, about kids of color, about LGBTQ kids? Again, there is no place for shame in education for any of the children that walk through school's doors. The fifth big idea is to build a community of support, to educate yourself, to reflect, to listen, and to build the capacity of others who can help row in the same direction. So what does this all boil down to? It boils down to love. Love them to life. Maya Angelou said, if you want to liberate young people, love them. Release them, free them to see that they may have something in them that can be of value, not only to themselves, but to the world. That's love. Love liberates. It does not bind. To truly be able to create the courageous classrooms where learning and academic excellence can be experienced, we have to drop the culture of shame and build a culture of empathy. For those who say, oh, well, vulnerability and being vulnerable and all this, warm and fuzzy stuff is not necessary or we don't have time for in schools. know this, and this comes from Brene Brown's research on vulnerability, that without vulnerability, you sacrifice innovation and creativity and accountability, adaptability, hard conversations, feedback, problem solving, ethical decision-making, trust, love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy. I want you to ask yourself, are we really willing to risk all of this to armor up and to keep those masks raised? There's a story from the Maasai warriors, one of the most fearsome warriors that exist on the planet. And regardless of if any one individual warrior has children of their own, in this culture, they greet each other by asking, "Are the children well?" They're not asking, "Are your children well?" or "Are my children well?" They're asking, "Are all of the children well?" Are all of the children well? This question centers and prioritizes the well-being of all children in the future generation. I wonder what could come of our society if we ask and center the question, are all children well? Not yours, not mine, but all children. So I know that there were a few questions. Kimberly, I'm not sure if you're sharing them or if you want me to.
Yes, I will share them, Alicia. Thank you so much. Okay, the first question that we have for you, sorry, I had to have notes, so I had to turn it back to this page. Does CRL or CRP, or culturally responsive pedagogy or learning, share the same principles as CRT? Critical race theory, for those of you that on the call that are not aware.
Yeah, so let's break down those letters, because those letters are getting, there's lots of confusion around those letters. They look similar, CRL, CRT, CRP, right? So CRT, if we're talking about critical race theory, it's exactly that. It's a theory that looks critically at the role race has played in our laws. It's a legal theory and it's a framework. This is taught in higher education institutions. It's used to help understand why racial inequities exist in our society and how we could eradicate them. It was developed by Derek Bell and some other legal scholars. But let me just repeat that that's a legal theory and a framework taught in higher education. CRT, critical race theory, is not taught in schools. So there's some misconceptions, and I want to clear up some misconceptions and truths about CRT. CRT, here's a myth, right? CRT is the same as anti-racism education or anti-bias education or culturally relevant teaching, which I'm going to get to. Another CRT, but very different or somewhat different. It's the same as diversity and inclusion training, and CRT is the same as multicultural training. That is the myth. The truth is that CRT is a legal and academic framework used in higher education. There is no place that CRT is taught in K-12 schools. So another myth is that CRT focuses on racism as an individual act. You did this to me. One person does it to another. Or that it blames all white people for racial inequities in society and the atrocities that have happened in the past. Or that it brainwashes children into a socialist, Marxist, communist, and anti-American agenda. Those are all the myths about CRT. When we think about culturally responsive teaching, another CRT, the truths about that is that learning about differences and different histories and races and cultures gives our students mirrors that reflect their own identities and also gives them windows to look into the world. So this idea of mirrors and windows, they can see themselves and they can see out into the world. And here's some truths, right? Like, young people are ingenious and they are really capable of learning about other people and their cultures. And that's helpful for them to be successful in the world and to engage with lots of different people. The other thing is that students have become so curious about why this conversation is so heated and have access to all the learning that we could ever possibly provide at the tips of their fingers. And they're ready to have these conversations. That we can trust students to talk about what's happening in the world around them. A truth is that when educators teach about different races and cultures, not CRT, critical race theory, but culturally responsive teaching, students starts to see themselves as a part of a bigger story. And that goes back to what I just talked about in the beginning, about seeing yourself existing in the world, about knowing that you matter and that you're valuable. And as a country, we're stronger because of our incredible diversity. It's important to note that CRT has become an all-encompassing kind of catch-all phrase for any conversations around differences, even conflated negatively with social emotional learning and trauma and self-care. And it's all become very mixed up and confusing for many people. CRT, critical race theory, is not taught in K-12 schools, but rather at the post-secondary level or in law schools. So culturally responsive teaching, also culturally responsive pedagogy or culturally responsive learning. What is that? I just started to give you a few insights into that, but it connects students' cultures, their languages, their life experiences with what they're learning in school. So it makes connections to young people's identities and then connects that to learning. These connections actually help students access rigorous curriculum and develop higher level academic skills. But for students of color or English language learners and other underserved student populations, those assets are often overlooked. And when that happens, educators miss the chance to support all learners. There's some neuroscience about this from Zaretta Hammond, if you wanted to look into it a little bit more deeply. But culturally responsive teaching values the assets that all students bring to the table. By doing that, it just raises the academic expectations for all learners. It also sends a message that multiculturalism is an asset, right? So it focuses on bringing, students' identities and assets to the classroom rather than what students can't do. And it raises the expectations and makes learning relevant. There's some really simple ways, like an example I can give you of how critical, culturally responsive teaching happens in a classroom. For example, I can do an opening activity asking students to partner up and share their name, the story of their name, and the meaning and how they got their names. And in that, you'll find lots of different stories about children's identities, how maybe it was rooted in religion or culture, or maybe they were named after a famous person, right? They just find out a little bit more about each other, and children can bring their identities and connect that to learning. How do we connect that to learning? Well, there's lots of ways, right? We can start to connect that to language. We can start to connect that to learning about other cultures. So culturally responsive teaching also supports social emotional learning. I know there's another question coming up about that. And it helps teachers to get to know their students. When we think about planning a lesson that's inclusive of SEL, teachers can use the knowledge that they have about students' lives. And pairing SEL with culturally responsive teaching helps to kind of navigate context both inside and outside of school. Kimberly?
Thank you, Alicia. Okay, our second question for you is, since teachers have always taught with each child's skill level in mind, does social emotional learning place undue burdens and responsibilities on the teacher?
This is a great question because lots of folks, school teachers, parents, might think that SEL is just one more thing on teachers' plates. But here's where I want you to just flip that. SEL is the plate, right? It's not one more thing on the plate. It is the plate. It's the entry point to learning. I just briefly talked to you about the brain and how the brain is developed and functions. And so remember what I said. We have to regulate young people, relate in the middle part of the brain to get to reason. Regulate, relate, reason. So without practicing some of the core competencies of SEL, which is self-awareness and social awareness and responsible decision-making, without using some of the practices of SEL, it's very hard for students to come into class and be regulated. And then in building a community in the classroom, we're accessing that middle part of kids' brains, the relate part of their brain. And then we get to content that's rich and children's minds are available and accessible for that. Social emotional learning has a couple of components that I want to clear up for you tonight. First, all learning is social and emotional. We learn through connecting with others. It's an integral part of education and human development. And SEL is a process. So it's a process through which all young people and adults get to build some skills that will help them develop healthy identities, to manage their emotions, to achieve goals, to show empathy, to create supportive relationships, and to make responsible decisions. SEL can also be leveraged for educational equity and excellence, but SEL, we can't SEL away, policies and practices that are not equitable. There's more work that can be done there. And this is done through authentic school and family community partnerships. Parents, schools want to partner with you on this so that we can build the bridge for young people between what they're learning in school and how to support that at home. And then lastly, a couple more ideas around what SEL is in order to create these learning environments where children feel trust and collaboration, and the curriculum and instruction is rigorous and meaningful, SEL has got to be present. This empowers young people to be co-creators and use their voice to create thriving schools and safe, just communities.
Okay, thank you. And I do have one more question for you, Alicia. It says, I want my child to embrace different cultures and diversity while still feeling proud of who they are. Do you have any suggestions for me on how to support my son?
I do, and I think that's such a wonderful question to think about how you can support your children through the challenges of understanding cultures and diversity and feel a sense of pride, right? And so yes, this starts with you, right? Many of us, I don't know about you, but many of us, our parents didn't have a high dose of consciousness around this area, right? And so here's our chance to do something a little different, and that might be uncomfortable. So I want you to engage here with me by just taking your hands and clasping them together, right? Just a few times, clasp your hands together and notice how they, come together. And then I want you to look down and notice if your left thumb is on top or your right thumb. Now, this is probably easy, probably comfortable, no big whoop, right? Now I want you to go ahead and interlace your fingers in the opposite way. So put your right thumb on top if you were a left thumb on top, and vice versa. And so many of you, if you were in a room with me, you would say, oh no, this feels so weird and strange. That's kind of the journey that you're on right now. Because this hasn't been second nature for many of us, or we didn't learn this from our parents to talk about race or culture or differences, it might be uncomfortable. Your first step is to just invite that discomfort. The more and more, so as you first interlaced your hands in the womb, they came together the way they did the first time, right? And you've been doing it that way ever since. And yet there's still another way to cross your hands. And the more that you cross your hands the opposite way, the more comfortable it will become. It won't be as awkward or strange to do that. And that's kind of like the journey that you're on right now. Can you just be truly curious, right? Can you be curious about your own experiences? What do you understand about race? What do you notice about your own physical reactions when hearing certain words or talking about certain topics? Children observe physical qualities from a really young age. They recognize height and weight and eye color and bodies and all these different things. And that's really normal to notice race, especially when there are differences from what they look like. right? So some statistics on this are at 6 months, children recognize race-based differences. At 18 months, they attach meaning to skin color. And from 2 to 4, children start to internalize racial bias. But by 12, children are set in their beliefs. And if we haven't actively had conversations that affirm multiculturalism or affirm different identities, then they're going to fill in the blanks with whatever they hear other places. I don't know about you, but I'm not going to leave that up to chance. So as a parent, I've been very intentional about how we have conversations around race in our families. And it started with books, right? It started with reading books that had characters that didn't look like my kiddos, or kids in wheelchairs and with different abilities. And so when we recognize children in community or people in community who looked like the people who were in our books, we could say, yeah, right? Some people get around on wheels and some people get around on legs, right? Or yeah, isn't that person's skin color beautiful? There's so many different shades. So going back to that affirming conversation. What often happens instead though, folks, and I'm sure that I'm not the only one that this has happened to, our children at the worst moment say the most embarrassing thing about recognizing differences of others. They say it in the grocery line where you're shoved in between two other people and they mention something about a characteristic that they see on the person in front of you. And what is our first response? Shh, don't talk about that. Shh, 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 don't say that. So what does that translate to? Yeah, that concept that we're hearing, that talking about race shames white children, yeah, that act of shushing our kids sends a loud message that something's wrong from a very young age. That shushing actually translates into shame. So we can help young people explore their natural curiosity about differences by asking questions. Like, what makes you think that? Or tell me what you mean. Where did you hear something like that? Or tell me more, right? Ask children, what have you seen? What do you know? What do you think you know? How does this make you feel? Why do you think that person responded that way? Sad, angry, etc. When we don't know what to say, we don't want to say anything because we don't want to screw up. But as I mentioned already, you're going to. Just accept that you're going to screw up. Talk to your children. They're already aware. Think about, how do you typically respond? And can you pause with that self-care that we talked about already? Can you find the opportunity to just pause, create space before your reaction? And that will be more intentional. So the big answer here is try not to avoid conversations just because you don't know. Ask more questions, right? Think about some things that might have you react, negatively, or the way you typically would react, and be prepared that you might shut down so that you can step into a new response. You can pause and answer more intentionally, or just ask more questions. That's all I got for you, Kim. I know it was a mouthful to each response, but I think it's important to really hash that out.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much, Alicia. I really appreciate it. And thank you to all of our consultants for being here this evening. It was a phenomenal night, and to all of our parents for being on this evening, and those parents that have submitted questions. We hope that we have answered them. And if not, like I said, you can reach out earlier, reach out after the presentation. You can email myself or Ms. Signore, and we'll get our consultants back to you. But at this point, I'm going to hand the mic over to Mrs. Signore, and she is going to end the evening for us. Maybe.
Great.
I think Mrs. Signore lost connection with us, so I am going to end it for her, and thank everybody again for being here this evening.
Thank you. Kim, can you?
Oh, now, Melissa, you're on now.
Yeah, Can you hear me? I had perfect connection until about 30 seconds ago.
Yes, I can hear you and see you.
Great. So I just wanted to reiterate what Mrs. Dowling said. Thank you so much to all of our experts that spent part of your evening with us tonight. Thank you so much to, of course, Mrs. Waldes, as well as the entire board for allowing us to really partner with the parents and getting the parents to have a chance to hear about some of the work that's happening in the schools, to maybe get some support on how they can do this work at home. And I think more importantly, a message that we've been saying over the last couple months is that this is such a crucial time for schools to be so laser focused on how to support kids, whether that's academic support, whether that's social and emotional support. They have just gone through 18 months of the most unstandardized way of living that they have ever experienced and hopefully will ever experience. And so we really need to bring in all the powers to be to help our kids get through this, bring back the rigor of the academics they need, along with that social support so that they're ready and available to learn. So I just, thank you so much. And I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much. And I hope everybody enjoyed the evening. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.